Jane into one of the faith stages, but the more we talk to Jane, the more we realize that Jane, I think, has some wisdom to share about how we move between the stages, which is really the tricky part, right? It's one thing to get the sense of where you're at, but how did you actually get there? And is there any form of intentionality of being able to move around in these stages a little bit? So, in talking to Jane about that when I was gone, and I think it was in Montana when I talked about that, we both realized that really, I think Jane could lead a talk on this where we could probably learn more in this setting than we could in the sermon setting. And so to sort of cap this series on faith stages, we thought we'd bring Jane in for that. So I'm going to turn it over to her, and then if you find it valuable, it's going to be recorded today. It'll be posted up on YouTube, so if you missed something, you can go back and click on our YouTube link and see it there. And then all of the faith stage testimonies will be on the web, right, Marty? This week. I've got them all staged. We just need to put them up there. So they'll all be up there as well. So if you missed a stage, you can go back, hear the sermon and the talk in accordance with that stage. If you find a stage mentioned today that you're like, I'm a little fuzzy on stage 2, I want to go back and revisit that. Okay? All right. Thank you, Jane, for being with us today.
Well, I appreciate.
Yeah, I'm going to turn to Eric off.
I really appreciate the invitation. When Holly first told me that she was going to be covering the stages of faith according to Fowler's theory, I was really excited because I really love this stuff. I think I picked up my first psychology book when I was like 14, and I haven't stopped putting them down since. So a little bit about my background. I have a degree in cognitive psychology, a bachelor's degree, and now I'm completing my master's in integral psychology. And integral psychology is sort of the latest, greatest theory. It's probably the most inclusive of all the psychological theories. So before I really get underway, I really wanted to find out from all of you if you're interested in hearing any particular aspect of each stage that you happen to have questions about. If you're interested in hearing more about the transition, if you're interested in hearing about any of the theory behind it, whatever questions came up for you during the course of the summer, I would be happy to direct my talk towards your questions and just whatever you're curious about. This is such a big topic. People get their PhDs in developmental psychology, and so I was trying to figure out a way to sort of summarize in an hour all of this material. So with that, does anybody have any questions?
Transitions?
Transitions. Okay, so that's really your primary interest. Okay, we'll cover that.
I was interested in whether it's more of a learning process or a reaction to life encounters or life experience.
Okay, that's an excellent question. Great. Okay. Let's wait until people kind of come in and settle down. And just to rehash a little bit, we're trying to kind of surface where your interest, where your questions are, what you're curious about learning about either stages, the individual stages, or transitions. And so far we've had the input that you'd really like to know more about the transitioning between these different stages, and then also what influences the transition. Is it relationship? Is it things that happen in your environment? Is it biological? Is it neuroscience? So that's a really good question as well. Does anybody else have anything that they are curious about? Okay, in the course of the discussion, I really want to have this be more interactive. And if you do have something that you just want to ask in the moment, go ahead and ask it. If I can't get to it, if it's going to sidetrack us too much, then I might put it off until the very end. And if we have time, I'll cover it then. You're welcome to stay behind, ask your questions then. So with that, psychology, the term first came into use in the English language in 1693, so it's a very old area of study. It was originally defined back then as the science of nature, functions, and phenomena of the human soul and mind. So in a sense, psychology is really the perfect bridge between science and religion or soul. In the past 100 years, the emphasis of psychology has really been very heavily weighted towards research, and it's really emulated the empirical model. So I share that with you because I know in presenting these different stages, I'm sure the question has come up, because I know it did when I was talking to Holly. She mentioned her husband just didn't like the idea of being put into a box, and that felt too confining for him. And it sort of takes away from the concept that we have of ourselves as being unique individuals, different from anyone else. And I'm going to sort of address that as we go. So really, the transition of psychology is really coming back to a balance between both the neurological, behavioral, biological science and the more metaphysical experiences of what it means to be fully human. The more recent areas of psychology, humanistic existential psychologies, involve that recognition that we all have tremendous human potential, that we all share an intrinsic desire for growth, wisdom, love, joy, and creativity. And we all have this desire, especially at the higher stages of development, for interconnectedness. For some of us, that interconnectedness takes the form of maybe relating to nature, to relating to our children, to relating to others, and feeling a sense of oneness, either in community or in relationship. And this recognition has really evolved with our own collective evolution and realizations. So the developmental psychology, the area that I'm going to discuss today, I would like you to reassure you fours that it is very heavily research-based. As a matter of fact, Piaget's work on cognitive development, for you teachers out there, you're probably aware of both Piaget's work and Erikson's work. And it was, Piaget first published his research in the 50s, and it was originally studied on the US population of children. Since that time, it's been tested and verified cross-culturally. So there seems to be this core trend of unfolding. And anthropologists even recognize that there's a similarity between early childhood development and our phylogenetic development as a species. So over the past 4.5 million years, we've evolved in the same pattern and in the same way, especially where cognitive function comes into play. So when you're watching your newborn child grow through the toddler stage, through middle childhood, you're actually watching history of mankind repeat itself in a very accelerated form. So I think that's kind of interesting. So Fowler's work is based on 3 theorists. It's based on Piaget, and it's based on Kohlberg, and Erik Erikson. Now, Piaget's work focused on the line of cognitive or intellectual development. Erik Erikson's work, he's really, although he did personality development and also cognitive development, his gift really has to do with stage transition. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Kohlberg's work, he was also a Harvard researcher. Both Fowler and Kohlberg, at different times, they were PhDs from Harvard, published a great deal of research. And so Fowler's work is based on a very solid scientific foundation. And his studies have been replicated, again, across culture. Fowler actually interviewed thousands of people from all different walks of life, all different spiritual faiths, different age groups. And so he was able to apply his knowledge to the different theories that were already in place and actually build on cognitive and moral theory. Piaget, what has been recognized from Piaget's work is that cognition and intellect is necessary for other lines of development, but it's not sufficient. So the reason why we're all unique human beings and we don't fit into just one single box is because there are multiple intelligences that we all possess. So cognition, intellect is one, emotional could be another, kinesthetic is another. I can promise you I will never learn to play basketball or hit a baseball. I have no line of development there, no hand-eye coordination in that regard. There's also emotional intelligence, which is very, very important. So while we all want to kind of move up Fowler's stages of development and get to the top, the reality is that your gifts may not be in spiritual development. You could be highly creative, emotionally intelligent, you could have a lot of gifts in terms of interpersonal skills. And all of these different lines of development play on one another, influence one another. They're not distinct and separate. They all have an impact. And in terms of the question of the impact of environment, biology, they all come into play. And integral psychology actually incorporates both nurture, nature, biology, culture, and systems. It's all connected. And at the higher stages of Fowler's work, you actually see how some of those systems interact with one another. So, while Fowler's work is just based on these three theorists, and there are a number of other theories, there's a number of other researchers involved in different relational lines, emotional development lines. Today we're just going to really focus on faith. And the reason why Fowler's work is really unique is because nobody else has really attempted to gauge what it's like to move up the ladder of spiritual growth. And his work is not, I would say that it's an invitation and a beginning. Even though it's solid work, the research is impeccable, I still would say that Fowler's work is an invitation because growth and development is so important. As we know in educating our children, if we're not aware of appropriate developmental stages, we could be kind of going in right over their heads. You know, an example of that, we just had an occurrence with my daughter Olivia, who's 5.5. She's transitioning between that cognitive stage of development where, you know, it's stage 1, fantasy, imagination, play acting, but she's entering conventional development. And when we enter a new stage and we're transitioning, even then, we're not 100% in the old stage. We're always at our very most stable stage placement. 50% of our attention is spent in our primary stage, which means 25% of us is reverting back. When we're tired, when we're stressed, we tend to revert back and go backwards. And at the same time, we're capable of reaching forward in the future 25% of the time. So you're never actually in one spot. It is a circular cycle that you go through, and you're going to navigate back and forth in an ebb and flow through these various stages of awareness. The reason why it's a positive thing to know about this stuff is because not only does it help you to be a better parent, but it helps you to interact with your employees, with family members. When you go to see movies, all of a sudden you're going to start seeing these different developmental stages, and you're like, okay, I know why the conflict is there. Because this person is talking up here, and this person is talking here, and they're going like this. So, you know, the words that we use, the way we communicate with each other, can actually increase our understanding of one another and our empathy of one another. The lower stages are no different than the more mature stages in terms of their value. Each stage has an intrinsic value to it. Each stage has a gift. And so in the handout that I gave you, I tried to expand just a little bit more. I know you have that wonderful chart that Holly and Dan provided for us. And what I attempted to do was to integrate some of these other theories and kind of flesh them out for you. So just to review real quickly, stage 1 is the intuitive projective faith, according to Fowler. And Kohlberg's moral hierarchy is the pre-conventional development. Piaget is sensor motor. The typical age range is 3 to 7 years. But 10% of the adults remain in this stage of development. Now, that's not typical, that's not usual. Usually, when you find an adult who remains in this childlike state, in psychology, we assume there's some sort of pathology or trauma. It can be due to injury. A number of different reasons why people arrest in a certain lower stage of development. Usually at the lower stages of development, just the whole neuroscience of brain development will carry us through those lower stages. If you have proper nutrition, if you have a loving, safe environment to grow up in, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs are met for safety, protection, all of those things, you know, then there's absolutely no reason why you're not going to just naturally gravitate to the next stage, because with the development of your prefrontal cortex, you're going to develop physically new capacities that go hand in hand with the stirrings and the desire to fulfill them. However, even at the earliest stages, you're going to have to navigate some sort of fear, because we like habits. We like being used to what we're used to. We don't like venturing off into the unknown. So to use Dan's metaphor of the water, at this stage, if you walked on water, they'd think, cool, when I grow up, I'm going to do that too. It really doesn't impress them, because everything is real. Anything that happens is kind of real. So in the gift of this stage is they have wonderful imagination, and they can tell, they love stories, that's how they understand their world. But the fear is, as they develop a more sophisticated way of thinking, and again, we're dealing with our 5-year-old over this, that she's having trouble reconciling leaving that fantasy life behind and becoming very preoccupied with rules. So rules and roles start to become more important in that next stage. And there is a conflict between those stages, as Holly discovered when she brought her 2 children over to visit. And Olivia was not happy that her children were breaking all of her rules about playing. It was just very disturbing to her. You know, Jackson doesn't know how to play with that. He doesn't play with it like I do. I want my friends here so they can play with it correctly. So she had this whole thing going. And before Holly left, she goes like, you guys are going to clean up, right? Hand on head and everything else. It's like, because that's the rule in my house. You cannot leave until you clean up. So I had to explain to her later on that babies that are not walking yet have a little bit of difficulty with that, and toddlers. Yeah, you know, at this stage, there's not a whole lot of empathy. It's very egocentric. It's all about me, my needs. You need to clean up my space and follow my rules. So, and we know adults like that in our lives. So, I did in your handout. I don't want this to frighten you, but I did put an example of the extreme pathological result of being stuck in this stage. And just to give you a good visual, it's Norman Bates in Psycho. Okay? So this was a guy who lived out in the middle of nowhere with his mother, who was a very dominant, authoritative figure in his life, did not allow him to progress and move beyond his current stage. And so when the woman died, he had to become her because he needed that authority figure. So that's an extreme case. But Alfred Hitchcock, you know, they don't call him the master of psychological thrillers for no reason. He really got the stage thing. Stage 2 is the mythic literal faith stage. It's Colbert's.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is it necessary for everybody to go through these stages, or can you start at, say, stage 3 and be a healthy person?
Oh, you want me to start at stage 3?
No, I'm just wondering if, is it possible to skip
jump
those
stages.
first 2
To
stages
jump
for some
stages?
reason? For some reason.
No, you can go through a stage super quickly, but you have to pass through it. It's just the nature. And now, actually, within the last 5 years, we've been able to, it's hard to say which came first, the chicken or the egg. Does our brain develop because we make decisions about how we want to be in the world? Or is there a biological imperative that causes us to behave? That's the old nurture versus nature issue. And in integral psychology, we would say that the two are co-arising. But again, you know, what Piaget has proven is none of us skip a stage. They've never found an exception. And I would challenge anybody who's familiar with research to find the results of a research project where nobody had, you know, where there was just no variables at all and no deviation from that norm. They've even done these studies in third world countries and indigenous tribes. And in indigenous tribes, they don't necessarily make it to the last stage of development because they are not exposed to our technological scientific form of thinking, so they don't maybe hit formal operation, but they do go through those earlier stages of development. And again, pathology at these earlier stages, it generally is an exception to the rule. We do have a choice. We do have choices, and that absolutely impacts how quickly and how healthy we are as we are striving to develop that really healthy ego, which I'll get to in a bit. So in stage 2, the characteristics, you know, it's that whole fantasy life turning into, okay, now I need to know what's real. And what's real is anything I can smell, taste, feel, or touch. And if you've raised children, then you know when they hit that stage of development, if you yourself break a rule, you're in trouble. Mom, you're not wearing your seatbelt. We cannot start the car until your seatbelt's on. So I don't know how many of you have been reprimanded by your 8-year-old, but that's kind of why. You know, they get very upset when you rock their boat that way because they need to keep their world in order. And the way they keep it in order is to divide everybody up. You have a specific role, you have a specific place, and that's not going to change. And that's just the developmental stuff they need to process to go through. So the gift of this stage is the ability to give rise to narrative, the emergence of story and myth. That's what gives them meaning and coherence to experience. And so again, because Olivia happens to be in the stage, I'll use her as my example. I have had to come up with endless stories about when her sisters were her age. Tell me a story about when Alex did this, or when she was bad, or when she got in trouble. Or tell me a funny story about. So stories are very important because it's their way of constructing their reality. It helps them make sense of it on an intuitive level. The fear at this stage, it arises around, well, what happens when your teacher has one rule in the classroom and your parents have an entirely different role at home? Well, that's a conflict of roles and rules. So that creates uncertainty. It doesn't make them feel safe. You're going to hear about it in your child if that happens because they want an explanation. And they want that solved for them so that they can put things back in their place. They'll organize. Olivia lines up all of her animals in a single row and organizes them by mama, baby, daddy, sister, brother. I mean, everybody has their place in her world. So the desire for transformation at this stage, again, it's probably due to the development of the human brain, which, by the way, in early childhood, 70% of the calories that a child consumes goes towards brain development. And that's unique to human beings. So that's how much growth happens in the human brain in terms of all of those neural connections and the brain structures developing. So the desire to transform is based on the emergence of formal operations, and this arises along with the desire to make sense of these different competing rules and roles. It becomes too crazy to keep all of these rules straight. So adults who fail to transform at this stage, they're very preoccupied with rules of social convention, and because that's what helps to organize their world. They emphasize appearance and social acceptance. They respect and protection is only gained through conformity to the larger group. They assume their own internal experience is also the same experience that other people have. They tend to see each other's needs and wants as similar to their own. They rarely question authority. And a really good example of this, I think everybody should see this movie because it has so much impact. Did anybody see The Reader?
Yes.
Yeah.
That was amazing.
Amazing movie, right?
Yes.
And you empathize with that main character. She's on trial post-World War II for war crimes. She worked as a guard in a concentration camp. But this woman is stuck in stage 3. She had earlier childhood neglect, and she wasn't really cared for in a safe and protective way, so she stays stuck in this conventional way of thinking. And so what happens is when her superiors tell her to do something, she thinks it is the highest moral good to do exactly what she's told. And so when she's on trial, she said, absolutely, I did those terrible things because I was told to do it. Now her superiors, who are also on trial at the same time, they get off scot-free because they know better, they know to lie. And they blame it on her. So it's a very, in one sense it's tragic, in one sense it's horrific, and in another sense it's a perfect example of why healthy parenting and feeding all of our children healthy food and providing that nurturing environment is so critical. Because as an adult out there in the world, they are like small children. They can be told to do anything, and if it's an authority figure, they'll say, okay, what do I do? I'm signing up for that. Because that's their highest good. Is there any other questions about that stage or about anything else that I mentioned so far? Okay, moving on to page 3. Stage 3 is the synthetic conventional stage of development, according to Fowler's theory. Kohlberg still rates this stage as conventional development, and with Piaget's cognitive theory, intellectually, the person is transitioning into more abstract reasoning. This usually happens early to late adolescence. You need abstract reasoning in order to do higher forms of math. 35% of the US population move into this stage and stay there. The relational and institutional spheres, it leads to confused boundaries. It leads to confused boundaries because, on one hand, there's a sense of the self as separate from the larger group, but yet loyalty and obedience to the larger group is the price of inclusion. And there's the recognition that that larger group is their safety net. So individual status is not important, but the status of the overall group is very important. And I don't want to put down fraternity and sororities because I know a lot of great people who are members of them, but you know, when I was in college and my friends were all rushing sororities, it was a huge deal out of which sorority was going to actually invite you to join their group. There was a whole hierarchy of different groups. Whichever group you ended up in, you were labeled for the rest of college as whatever the reputation for that group was. I declined. I was not in the conformist stage of development when I entered college. My parents would say I was never in the conformist stage, although I'm sure that's not true. So the gift, there are gifts at this stage, and the main gift is the ability to form your own personal myth This represents the ability to make sense of your past, your present, and your future, and to start to create a story of your life's journey and what you hope that will be. So, meaning is created within the context of environment, personality, and relationships, but that story is beginning to emerge. Now, the fear at this stage is, and you know, I'm going to name another movie since it seems like we like movies at this church. I love movies. Has anybody read or seen, actually it just came out, the book, The Help?
Yes.
Okay. So this is a great example of somebody who comes home from college. She's still in stage 3, but she's already feeling the stirrings of being drawn into stage 4. As most of you know, she's a Southern woman who was raised by a black maid who she was very deeply attached to, closer to the maid than she was to her own mother. And when she comes home from college, she finds that this maid has been dismissed, and she has no idea why. She belongs to a very tight-knit group of women who, that's her peer group. She grew up with these women. They belong to this special league where they do a lot of charity work. And this is her main sense of being connected and associated and feeling like she belonged. Unfortunately, she began to see, this is set in the scenery of just the very beginning of the civil rights movement. And she begins to feel uncomfortable. And at first she's not sure why. And she's just a normal, average person. She's not somebody who sets out to be a hero or somebody to make a huge name for herself or anything like that. She simply wants the freedom to be a writer and to meet with her friends and to work on this writing project and have everybody love her. Well, as most of you know, that's not the way it turns out. And she actually ends up having to sacrifice everything in order to move into this new stage. Now, most of us don't have to give up quite as much. We don't have to give up our families, all of our closest friends, and all of our cultural associations and affiliations in order to move to the next stage. But again, you know, with any stage transition, there's a sacrifice to be made. It feels a little bit like jumping off a cliff into the unknown. And it really does feel like that. Underhill, she was another writer who spoke about spiritual states and stages. You know, she described what's called the dark night of the soul. The way she described the dark night of the soul is a period of darkness that you enter when you've come along a certain path of spiritual development. But I would argue with that a little bit. I think every stage is difficult. I think every stage there's something that has to be sacrificed. And you can't yet see the greater gift. The greater gift usually comes in the form of a greater capacity to be in the world. It comes with a greater sense of freedom. There's a lot to be gained by moving through these difficult stages and transitioning through them. And as you can tell by some of the scary examples I've given you, there can be a pretty severe price to pay for trying to stay in the same place. Human beings, because we have free will, we're the only living beings that can actually willfully prevent our own evolution. Everything in the universe evolves. The whole entire universe is evolving. The world is constantly evolving, changing, and we change as well. We go from infancy to old age. That's a miraculous change. Well, our insides go through the same sorts of changes. They should go through the same sorts of changes. We're meant to. And this is actually very close to the story, our Christian story. The story of making those sacrifices, of being willing to die in one sense, because that's how the ego perceives it. When the ego is leaving one stage and entering another, it doesn't want to go. It's going to fight you tooth and nail, and it uses fear to do that. So, in getting back to stage 3, the fear is exclusion from the group, and it does feel like a death. Failure to transform in this stage requires a denial of your emergent expanded values due to an over-reliance on the evaluation of others. You are stuck trying to embrace the old values while your heart is trying to lead you in a different direction. Sometimes betrayal by an admired authority figure can cause a great deal of despair and depression, sometimes even a nihilistic perspective. So negativity and skepticism can become projected outward towards others. A very good example of this is, most of you I'm sure remember Archie Bunker. So Archie Bunker wasn't going to budge. He's like, good, I'm in stage 3. Interestingly enough, his wife, Edith, is trying to transition into that 4. But Edith, she represents the more positive side of a healthy 3. She's very positive, nothing really gets her down, everything's going to be fine, and that's also the gift of a stage 3. They're very positive. Refusing to transition, you end up a little cranky. And you end up blaming a lot. Stage 4, individuative, reflective faith is Fowler, conventional, is still in Kohlberg's description. But yet, we're now entering formal operations, and 29% of the US adults remain at this stage, stage 4. And the reason why Piaget stops at formal operations is because in the 50s, Piaget saw the scientific, empirical way of reasoning to be the highest form of cognitive function. Well, now that people have moved somewhat beyond that, we know that it is simply another stage. And it's an important one. And I think the last 100 years have seen just tremendous gifts of this stage that we've been the benefactors of. I mean, unprecedented advances in technology and communication have really turned the world on its head. So with things like mass communication, the internet, we can now shine a light on the darkest part of the world. And dictators are not able to get away with repressing their people forever. Dictators who are in an earlier stage, stuck in an earlier stage of development, and their populace is actually maturing beyond them. So having access to this kind of technological connectivity has actually helped us to push through that technological, scientific way of being into even higher stages of development. So this stage is characterized, again, it's the conceptual framework sees causality as linear, A plus B always equals C. It views reality as completely objective, that reality actually stands still and is solid. Variables are completely independent and can be isolated. Boundaries of objects are completely finite. Objects exist outside of personal perception. So, again, this is sort of a very advanced, concrete way of looking at things, but it's able to take these separate concrete objects and manipulate them. And all of a sudden there's the recognition that there's all these different choices. So this stage is actually a stage of freedom. Because with scientific thought, you become the master of your own destiny. So people at this stage, they realize that they can be independent agents. They can orchestrate their own lives because they're able to perceive and choose from both alternative beliefs and values. Reality exists only in the rational waking consciousness, what you can see, hear, and touch and feel. Internal experience and other states of consciousness, they're just not important, or they don't exist. A dream is a dream, it's in your imagination. You can't prove it. Anything that happens on the interior, well, that's just subjective. So this stage tends to be pretty dismissive of internal forms of experience. But you know what? When you see what needs to be accomplished in this stage, that's okay. because really the job of this stage is to manipulate what is out there in the world and to make sense of the world in a brand new way. You know, the ability of this stage 2 is also for the first time to be able to look back and reflect and be able to have a sense of one's own self, one's own identity, to sort out group norms and behaviors and whether or not you agree with them or don't agree with them. This is a stage of tremendous freedom. The fear here, and probably the fear here of transition is greater than any other fear in any other stage. The reason being that this is the culmination of mature ego development. And by ego, in psychology, we don't mean you're arrogant. Everyone has one. The ego is a way to organize and structure our self-identity. So it's like describing the structure of the psyche or the mind. And the ego at this stage, because of its new sense of freedom, its new sense of agency and independence, it's arrived. Okay, another book, Bonfire of the Vanities. Movie, book, nobody saw it? Yeah. Okay, so they call themselves masters of the universe. So this is the stage where people perceive themselves as masters of the universe because they can manipulate and control. They can, you know, the creative potential in this stage is just amazing. And so it's easy to feel godlike. It's easy to become the center of your own universe. And in that particular story, this master of the universe, who is a Wall Street bond trader or some such thing, made $1 zillion a year, he realizes that his uneven development when he accidentally hits a pedestrian and doesn't know whether he's killed him or not. All of a sudden he realizes his moral reasoning is practically non-existent. His emotional development and his relationships in his lives start to be impacted. Everything starts to crumble for him. And he has a choice at this point. As a matter of fact, in this stage, it usually requires some sort of external crisis, either a loss or something shocking happening, in order to wake this person up to say, you know what? Intellectual capacity is not the be-all and end-all. There's still a spiritual domain, there's a relational domain, there's all these other aspects of life that need to be somehow incorporated into my sense of self. So this is where we start to enter the 5th stage. And does anybody have any questions yet? Because I know we're closing in on 5 or 10 minutes left of the hour. I just want to make sure that I'm able to address people's concerns, questions. Okay. So the 5th stage is called the conjunctive faith stage, according to Fowler. It's also known as post-conventional develop, according to Kohlberg. And here I mentioned Levinger because, you know, again, Piaget sort of bails out on us at this point. We don't know what's happening with the brain here, although on the back for references, I included a book called Buddha's Brain because that incorporates the last 5 years of brain science. It's very easy layman's read. It's not too technical. It tells you about kind of what's happening biologically. And in that book, you will discover that brain development actually continues well into adulthood, and it can potentially continue until the day you drop dead. We know now that there's one little structure of the brain, you can actually grow new brain cells. It's right behind the prefrontal cortex. And people who practice meditation and spiritual practices, other spiritual practices, they have a highly developed ACC. And it gets bigger, and there's more neural connections that are formed. So there is probably still a biological basis as we move up the ladder, but the biological basis is not driving the development at this stage. It's probably more a conscious decision and it probably requires more will to navigate at these higher stages. But the brain will follow if you're willing to go there. So that's the good news. The key word in neuroscience is neuroplasticity. Our brains are highly elastic. That's not what I was taught 30 years ago in cognitive psychology. Our brains were like done by 15. So. Okay, so in conjunctive faith, 14% roughly of the US population are in this category. The characteristics are, like Dan mentioned in his sermon, there's really a reconciliation between what is hardcore science and what is symbolic. And these stirrings of earlier years of, these great stories, myths, the imagination that we had as children, these things start to surface again, and we begin to experience them in a brand new way. And at this stage, we're trying to reconcile what is the meaning of that, or how do we make sense of unusual experiences that we have, or different states of mind, or perhaps even an unusual spiritual experience that you're afraid to tell anybody because you're afraid that they're going to tell you you're crazy. At the higher levels of development, and even at the lower levels of development, it's well documented, there are distinct spiritual states that people can enter. And we have brain imaging for those of you still in the 4th stage of development. So we can actually prove to you that they happen, they exist. And you can say, well, the mind causes it, but chicken or egg, it's up for debate. So in this stage, you begin to become aware of that struggle, and you try to reconcile those very different ideas. You come to understand that nothing is separate from anything else. You know that variables are interdependent, that boundaries are open, that they fluctuate depending on how systems are organized and defined. And while there really is some form of objective reality, all meanings and interpretations are constructed, and all constructs are partial. So it's a very humbling stage, because we realize that no matter how far up this ladder we travel, our view, as far as we know it in the human form today, is always going to be partial. There's no such thing as personal objectivity, because the observer actually influences what is being observed. And quantum mechanics pretty much bears that out. At this stage, people think in terms of symbols and in terms of systems, and how those systems interact with one another, influencing outcomes across time. And at this stage, you tend to have a longer time frame. So you think in terms of past generations, future generations. You're not just concerned with your own lifespan or your children's lifespan. You're thinking beyond that. You're beginning to think of what your legacy might be. The gift of this stage is the ability to hold themselves within and outside their cultural and personal identities and perceive their view as one aspect of a multifaceted system. They begin to perceive paradoxes. They can perceive the whole while knowing that their perception is only partial. It's a stage that understands larger complexity. And at this stage, the strength of this stage and the weakness of this stage is that it glimpses the possible unification of all mankind and of all living beings. It sees the interconnectedness and how that can all work. And at the same time, they are very clear about the reality of how impossible that dream might seem. So the failure to transform in this stage is based on fear of either entering that unitive stage 6, where there's a lot of self-sacrifice involved. I had a friend who once told me, he was an African American, and I told him, he was in sales, and he had such a great personality, and I was, oh, you should go into politics. You'd be perfect at it. You're just the perfect person to communicate these kinds of things to. Because he agreed with all my politics, so I thought he was the best person. And he laughed at me and he said, you know what, I'm not going there because, all the great black leaders, they get shot. I don't want to go there. So there's that reluctance to put yourself out. And also there's an awareness that it's not just you, that you have people that depend on you, that you're responsible for, and that they're going to pay a price. You know, Jesus once told his followers, and I don't know, I can never get these quotes from the Bible right, so I'm not even going to try. But essentially, he told his followers that, you know, you should be prepared to leave your house, to leave your mother, to leave your brothers and siblings behind, that none of it really matters. Your family doesn't matter. Now, what religion would they tell you your family doesn't matter? Try telling that to a mom. So it really requires a great deal of bravery and strength and fearlessness to transition into the final stage. And basically, I don't need to talk too much about stage 6. First of all, it's here if you want to read more about it. But the reality of it is that they have no fear. They've transcended fear. For the most part, they've transcended ego. So that's not even a concern. They seem to have simplistic wisdom about them. They're very magnetic. They're very good speakers. They're good communicators. They have a sense of peace and joy, and nothing really ruffles their feathers. They don't need Valium, they have meditation. So, in any case, those are the stages that we've currently defined, but I did include for you a handout, and it's like a psychograph of, I think it's like the third page towards the back. And if you're interested in reading more about this kind of stuff, those are all the major players. I think it's the third page from the back. And at the bottom, there's all the different theorists, and each of those lines defines a different line of development. So you have cognitive development.